Blood dripped from the Alpha King's heavy leather boots, staining the freshly scrubbed stones of the isolated cottage. Milo, the most merciless warlord of the North, gripped the shattered doorframe. He expected absolute terror from the lone woman inside. Instead, Lucia raised a simple straw broom, pointing the wooden handle directly at his massive, blood-soaked chest. "If you take one more step with those filthy boots," she declared, her dark eyes locking onto his without a fraction of fear, "I will hit you." The brutal sovereign, a man who slaughtered entire armies without mercy, froze. His scawed hand hovered dangerously over the hilt of his heavy sword. He stared at the fragile peasant woman. Then, slowly, the deadliest man alive did the unthinkable. The winter storm rattled the wooden shutters of the isolated cottage. Lucia pushed the straw broom across the hearthstones with steady strokes. Dust and dried pine needles gathered in a neat pile near the door. This small house was her only sanctuary against the freezing wilderness. She wiped her damp brow with the back of her sleeve. Outside, the wind screamed through the bare trees. The fire crackled softly, throwing warm shadows against the timber walls. Lucia took pride in the cleanliness of her home. A clean floor meant order in a world full of chaos and hunger. She paused to listen to a heavy thud against the outer wall. It was not the sound of a falling branch. Footsteps crunched heavily through the deep snow. Lucia gripped the wooden handle of her broom. The heavy oak door suddenly burst open with a violent slam. Freezing air rushed into the room, extinguishing the candle on the table. A large silhouette blocked the doorway, breathing heavily. Milo gripped the doorframe to stay upright. Blood dripped from his torn tunic, staining the fresh snow on the threshold. He was the ruler of the Northern Territory, a man known for his merciless rule. Tonight, he was merely a hunted man escaping a treacherous ambush. Milo stepped forward, ignoring the agonizing pain in his side. His heavy leather boots left a thick, dark streak of mud on Lucia's clean floor. The wet clay mixed with melting snow and old blood. Lucia looked down at the ruined stones she had spent hours scrubbing. Anger flared hot beneath her ribs, replacing her initial fear. She raised the straw broom, pointing the bristled end at his chest. "Stop right there," Lucia said, her voice steady and sharp. Milo blinked through the dark hair falling into his eyes. He was not accustomed to hearing commands from peasants. His hand instinctively went to the hilt of his heavy sword. "Move aside, woman," Milo growled, his voice like grinding stones. He took another step, leaving a second muddy footprint. "If you take one more step with those filthy boots, I will hit you with this broom," Lucia declared. She did not lower the wooden handle. Her eyes locked onto his gaze with absolute defiance. Milo stared at the simple housemaid before him. He could crush her throat with a single hand. His soldiers trembled at his silent glances. Yet this ordinary woman stood her ground over a patch of dirt. The absurdity of the situation pierced through his exhaustion. He looked down at his boots, then at the raised broom. The warmth of the cottage began to thaw his frozen skin. The smell of dried lavender and wood smoke filled his senses. It was a world completely separate from his violent battlefields. Milo let go of his sword hilt. He leaned his heavy back against the stone wall near the entrance. With a slow, painful movement, he unbuckled his left boot. He dropped the mud-caked leather onto the doormat. He worked on the right buckle, his fingers stiff from the biting cold. The second boot hit the mat with a heavy thud. Lucia watched him closely, her posture remaining tense. Milo stood in his woolen stockings, his chest heaving. "Is this satisfactory?" he asked quietly. Before she could answer, his knees buckled beneath his weight. Milo slid down the wall, his consciousness slipping away. He collapsed onto the edge of the clean floor, his pale face resting near the doormat. Lucia lowered the broom slowly. She stepped closer to the unmoving giant. The iron scent of blood now dominated the small room. She realized he was terribly wounded. Her anger evaporated, replaced by the instinct to save a life. She set the broom against the wall. Milo lay perfectly still, his breathing shallow. Lucia knelt in front of him, careful to avoid the mud. She pushed his matted hair asunder from his forehead. His skin felt burning hot despite the winter storm outside. She needed to move him closer to the fire. He was far too heavy for her to lift alone. She grasped the collar of his tunic and pulled with all her strength. He moved only a few inches across the smooth stones. She gasped for air, sweating despite the chill from the open door. She managed to close the heavy door, locking out the howling wind. The silence returned to the cottage, broken only by his ragged breaths. Lucia fetched a basin of warm water from the hearth. She brought a clean cloth and her basket of dried herbs. She sat on the floor beside the unconscious ruler. She began to cut away the blood-soaked fabric of his shirt. A deep gash stretched across his ribs, oozing dark blood. Milo groaned in his sleep, but did not wake. Lucia cleaned the wound with gentle, practiced motions. She applied a poultice of crushed marigold and yarrow. She wrapped his torso tightly with clean linen strips. Her hands shook slightly as she worked. She knew who this man was from the crest on his silver ring. He was the feared king who ruled the lands beyond the forest. Stories spoke of his cruelty and his heart of stone. Yet here he lay, vulnerable and shivering on her kitchen floor. He looked younger without the glare of authority in his eyes. Lucia fetched her heaviest wool blanket from her bed. She spread it over his large frame, tucking it around his shoulders. She sat back against the cabinets, watching him through the night. The storm continued to batter the cottage until dawn. Milo did not stir for hours. The fire burned down to glowing embers. Lucia added another log to keep the room warm. She looked at the muddy footprints near the door. She smiled faintly at the memory of her own boldness. She had threatened a king with a broom, and the king had obeyed. The morning light burnt through the frosted window panes. Milo opened his eyes, staring at the low ceiling. His body ached with a dull, throbbing pain. He smelled vegetable broth simmering nearby. He tried to sit up, but a sharp pain in his ribs made him gasp. "Do not move," a soft voice commanded from the hearth. Lucia walked over, holding a wooden bowl. Milo looked at her, remembering the broom from the night before. He felt a strange sense of shame for his weakness. "Where am I?" he asked, his throat dry. "You are in my home, where mud is not welcome," she replied. She set the bowl on the floor beside him. Milo noticed his boots were gone, cleaned and placed neatly by the door. He looked at his bandaged chest, then at her tired face. "You saved my life," he noted. "I saved my floor first," she said with a small smile. Milo let out a short laugh which turned into a wince. He looked at the broth, realizing how starved he was. He raised himself up on one elbow, refusing to show more vulnerability. Lucia handed him the wooden spoon. He took it, his large hand completely covering the handle. The simple meal tasted better than any banquet in his castle. She sat opposite him, her hands folded in her lap. "The soldiers will come looking for me," Milo warned. "Then I suggest you finish your breakfast before they arrive," she answered calmly. Milo studied her quiet strength. He had lived his life surrounded by sycophants and enemies. Nobody had ever treated him like an ordinary man. This woman did not fear his title. She only cared about the rules of her own small domain. He swallowed the last drop of broth and set the bowl down. "My name is Milo," he said, offering a rare piece of honesty. I know, she replied simply. And you are? He asked. Lucia, she said, standing up to gather the dishes. Milo watched her walk to the water basin. He felt a protective instinct stirring within his chest. He was used to protecting kingdoms, not individuals. Yet this fragile house felt worth defending. He tried to stand, using the wall for support. His legs were shaky, but his determination was absolute. Lucia did not look back, continuing her work. Your boots are dry, she mentioned over her shoulder. Milo looked at the leather boots by the door. They were free of mud, polished with old grease. He realized she had worked through the night for him. A warmth expanded in his chest, unrelated to the fire. He walked slowly toward the door. He picked up his boots, careful not to touch the stone floor with his bare feet. He sat on the small bench near the entrance to put them on. Thank you, Lucia, he said quietly. She turned around, her expression serious. Do not return with blood next time, she stated. Milo smiled, a genuine expression that rarely crossed his face. I will remember, he promised. He opened the door, stepping out into the cold morning air. The forest was quiet after the storm. He knew his enemies were still searching for him. He needed to find his loyal guards and reclaim his throne. But his mind remained trapped in the warm cottage. He looked back one last time before entering the trees. Lucia was already standing at the door with her broom. She began to sweep away the snow he had brought in. Milo turned away, walking with purpose. He would return to this place. He would ensure her sanctuary remained safe from the world. The king had found something more valuable than power. He had found a home. Milo reclaimed his stone fortress before the winter snow began to melt. His loyal commanders rallied behind him the moment he emerged from the forest. The rebellion ended swiftly in the main courtyard of the stronghold. He dealt with the traitors using the harsh justice his reputation demanded. Nobody questioned his authority or the cold resolve in his eyes. Yet the great hall of his castle felt hollow. The stone walls offered protection but provided no real warmth. Servants rushed to fill his goblet and tend to the roaring fireplaces. He sat on his heavy wooden chair and watched the flames. His mind frequently drifted away from the reports of his generals. He remembered a small cottage filled with the scent of dried lavender. He remembered a brave woman holding a simple straw broom. Spring brought heavy rain to the northern valleys. Deep tracts of muddy water covered the village roads. Lucia packed her woven basket with careful precision. She had spent the last 3 weeks foraging for early spring roots. Her supply of winter grain was running dangerously low. She wrapped her thin shawl tightly around her shoulders. The walk to the market town took 2 hours of steady pacing. She navigated the ruined paths with practiced balance. The market square bustled with merchants and local farmers. Smells of roasted meat and wet wool filled the damp air. Lucia found an empty wooden crate near the blacksmith's forge. She arranged her bundles of willow bark and yarrow in neat rows. A few early customers stopped to trade copper coins for her remedies. She counted her meager earnings with a quiet sense of relief. It would be enough to buy flour and a small block of cheese. A harsh voice suddenly cut through the murmur of the crowd. 3 soldiers pushed their way through a group of helpless farmers. They wore the dark armor of the local garrison. Lucia recognized the greed shining in their eyes. They were supposed to protect the village, but they often exploited it. The tallest soldier stopped in front of her modest display. He kicked the wooden crate with the steel toe of his boot. You owe a trading tax to the garrison, the man declared loudly. Lucia looked up at him with steady composure. I have already paid the gatekeeper this morning, she replied. She placed a protective hand over her leather coin pouch. The soldier sneered and leaned closer to her face. "The gatekeeper collects for the town, but you must pay us for protection," he demanded. He reached out to grab her basket of herbs. Lucia snatched the basket away before his fingers could touch it. "I do not require your protection," she stated firmly. Her defiance caught the attention of the surrounding merchants. The crowd grew silent, watching the uneven confrontation. The soldier's face flushed red with sudden anger. He drew a short dagger from his belt. "You will give me the coins, or I will take them," he threatened. Lucia slipped her hand into her apron pocket. He gripped the bone handle of her own carving knife. She was afraid, but she refused to surrender her survival to thieves. The soldier took a step forward, raising his weapon. A loud horn sounded from the northern end of the square. The deep blast echoed off the stone buildings. Heavy hooves thundered against the muddy cobblestones. A dozen armored riders entered the market in perfect formation. The crowd scrambled backward to clear a wide path. At the center of the formation rode Milo on a massive black horse. He wore a dark traveling cloak over his silver chestplate. His expression was unreadable and dangerously calm. The three corrupt soldiers instantly dropped their aggressive posture. They scrambled to stand in the straight line, trembling visibly. Milo pulled on his reins, bringing his horse to a halt. He looked down at the disrupted market stall. His eyes scanned the faces of the terrified villagers. Then his gaze landed on Lucia. She still held her basket, standing tall amidst the chaos. Milo felt a sudden jolt in his chest. He recognized the defiant tilt of her chin. It was the same look she'd given him over a dirty floor. Milo dismounted his horse with smooth efficiency. His leather boots splashed into a shallow puddle. He handed the reins to his nearest guard without looking back. The crowd held its breath as he walked forward. The corrupt soldier dropped his dagger into the mud. He fell to his knees, pressing his forehead toward the ground. "My lord, we were merely collecting taxes," the man lied, his voice shaking. Milo ignored the kneeling man entirely. He stopped 2 paces away from Lucia. He looked at the overturned crate and the scattered willow bark. He looked at the small knife she still gripped in her pocket. "Are these men bothering you?" Milo asked. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the silent square. Lucia met his gaze, recognizing the man she had nursed back to health. He looked entirely different in his fine armor. Yet he still had the same dark, intense eyes. "They demanded coins I do not owe," Lucia answered clearly. Milo turned his head slightly toward his captain. "Strip them of their armor," Milo ordered. The command was final and devoid of emotion. "Send them to the salt mines at the border," he added. The 3 soldiers began to beg and weep. Milo's personal guards dragged the men away without hesitation. The swift judgment left the entire market in stunned silence. Milo turned his attention back to the muddy ground. He knelt slowly, his heavy armor clicking as he moved. He reached into the wet dirt with his bare hands. He picked up a bruised bundle of yarrow. He gently shook the mud from the delicate leaves. The villagers stared in absolute disbelief. Their ruthless ruler was performing the task of a peasant. Lucia watched him, her heart beating a little faster. Milo stood up and held out the herbs. "Your goods are damaged," he noted. "I can wash them at the river," she replied softly. Milo looked at her worn dress and her thin shawl. He saw the physical toll the lingering winter had taken on her. He reached inside his cloak and produced a heavy velvet pouch. He placed the bag of silver coins directly into her empty basket. "This will cover the cost of the damaged herbs," he said. Lucia looked at the immense wealth sitting in her basket. It was more money than she could earn in 10 lifetimes. "This is far too much," she objected, shaking her head. Consider it payment for the medical supplies you used on me, Milo insisted. He took a step back, giving her space. He remembered how fiercely she guarded her independence. I will not accept charity, Lucia said, lifting her chin. Milo allowed a small smile to touch his lips. It is not charity, he assured her. It is a debt paid by a man who tracks mud into clean houses, he added. A few merchants exchanged confused glances at his words. Lucia finally let out a quiet sigh. Then your debt is settled, she accepted. She picked up her basket, preparing to leave. Milo did not want her to disappear into the crowd. The roads are not safe for a woman traveling alone with silver, he stated. I have managed by myself for a long time, she reminded him. That does not mean you must continue to do so, Milo countered. He signaled to his captain with a brief nod. 2 of my men will escort you safely to your door, he declared. Lucia looked at the armored knights waiting for his command. She knew arguing with him in front of his subjects was useless. As you wish, she conceded gracefully. Milo watched her turn and walk down the muddy street. 2 heavily armed riders followed at a respectful distance. He stood in the damp square long after she was out of sight. The villagers slowly returned to their business, speaking in hushed whispers. Milo wiped the dirt from his hands using a linen cloth. He mounted his horse and turned back toward the fortress. The silver coins would keep her fed and warm. The guards would keep her safe from thieves. But he knew it was not enough to ease his restless mind. He needed to see the inside of that clean cottage again. The 2 heavily armed guards left Lucia at the edge of the forest. She carried her heavy basket down the familiar dirt path toward her cottage. The silver coins weighed heavily against the coarse fabric of her pocket. She felt a strange mixture of gratitude and profound melancholy. The survival of her household was secured for the coming year. She unlocked the heavy oak door and stepped into the cold room. The hearth fire had died down to white ash during her long absence. Lucia quickly set her goods on the wooden table. She needed dry kindling to revive the dying embers. The wooden shed leaned heavily against the back of the cottage. Smells of damp earth and rotting pine bark hung in the still air. Lucia reached for a stack of split logs near the corner. A sudden rustle from the shadows made her freeze in place. She picked up a heavy piece of firewood and held it defensively. "Who is hiding there?" she asked in a firm voice. Only the sound of shallow, ragged breathing answered her question. Lucia stepped closer to the pile of discarded burlap sacks. She pulled the rough fabric away to reveal a tiny, trembling figure. A young girl huddled against the cold earth, her arms wrapped around her knees. The child wore thin, torn garments unsuitable for the harsh northern spring. Her bare feet were pale and covered in dried mud. Lucia dropped the firewood instantly. The lingering devastation of the border wars had left many children destitute. The bitter environment claimed those without shelter without mercy. Lucia knelt in the dirt and reached out a hand. The little girl flinched backward, pressing her thin shoulders against the wooden wall. "I will not hurt you," Lucia whispered gently. She kept her hands steady, waiting for the child to assess the situation. Hunger eventually overcame the girl's natural vigilance. She looked at Lucia's calm face and slowly uncurled her stiff limbs. Lucia removed her own shawl and wrapped it tightly around the shivering child. She lifted the girl into her arms, surprised by how light she felt. The child weighed no more than a bundle of dry branches. Lucia carried her out of the dark shadow and into the cottage. She placed the girl on the wooden bench nearest to the hearth. Lucia worked quickly to start a new fire with the remaining embers. Flames soon licked at the dry wood, casting a warm glow across the room. She retrieved a fresh loaf of bread and a block of cheese from her basket. She tore a soft piece of bread and handed it to the child. The girl took it with trembling fingers and ate with desperate speed. "Eat slowly, or your stomach will reject it," Lucia warned softly. She filled an iron pot with water and placed it over the fire. She began to chop carrots and potatoes to make a nourishing stew. The cottage slowly filled with the comforting smell of cooking vegetables. "What is your name?" Lucia asked without stopping her work. The child swallowed her bread and looked at the floor. "Ilara," the girl replied in a barely audible whisper. "Well, Ilara, you are safe here," Lucia stated firmly. She handed the girl a wooden bowl filled with warm, thick stew. Ilara held the bowl with both hands, letting the heat seep into her skin. 3 quiet days passed in the isolated sanctuary. Lucia washed Ilara's muddy clothes and scrubbed the dirt from her skin. She cut down one of her own spare dresses to fit the small frame. The cottage felt different with a second person breathing its air. The profound silence of Lucia's solitary life is broken by soft footsteps. On the afternoon of the 4th day, a heavy knock echoed through the room. Lucia stopped sweeping the floor and looked toward the door. Ilara immediately dropped her wooden spoon and hid behind the large armchair. Lucia walked to the entrance and pulled the iron latch. Milo stood on the threshold, filling the entire doorframe with his massive shoulders. He wore a simple dark tunic instead of his heavy silver armor. His dark hair caught the afternoon sunlight, softening his usually stoic features. He looked down at his feet before stepping inside. His boots were completely free of mud and dust. "I ensured they were clean," Milo said, his voice deep and calm. Lucia felt an unexpected smile form on her lips. "You learn quickly," she replied, stepping aside to let him enter. Milo walked into the room, his eyes scanning the familiar space. His sovereign authority usually demanded immediate submission from everyone he met. Here he felt a strange desire to simply exist without a crown. He noticed a small pair of mismatched shoes sitting near the hearth. Milo turned his head and saw a pair of terrified eyes peering from behind a chair. He froze, his combat instincts temporarily confusing his mind. He was prepared for assassins, not a fragile child. Ilara stared at the towering man, recognizing the dangerous aura he carried. Milo looked at Lucia for an explanation. "I found her in the woodshed 3 days ago," Lucia explained quietly. "She has nowhere else to go," she added. Milo looked back at the trembling girl. He knew the brutal reality of the world outside this forest. He understood the dark abyss that swallowed the weak and the unprotected. His presence was clearly terrifying the young orphan. Milo slowly unbuckled the heavy sword belt from his waist. He set the deadly weapon on the table, far out of reach. He then lowered his large frame onto the wooden floorboards. He crossed his legs, making himself as small as physically possible. The contrast between his muscular build and his grounded posture was stark. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small block of smooth pine wood. He withdrew a small carving knife from his boot. Ilara watched him intently, her curiosity slowly overriding her fear. Milo did not look at the child directly. He focused entirely on the piece of wood in his hands. He guided the sharp blade across the grain with precise, fluid motions. Wood shavings fell onto his dark trousers like a dusting of snow. Lucia watched the ruthless king perform a task suited for a village grandfather. The silence in the room stretched out, peaceful and unbroken. Milo carved the rough shape of a small horse. He smoothed the edges with his thumb, checking the balance of the wooden toy. He placed the finished horse on the floorboards and nudged it forward. The wooden toy slid across the clean stones and stopped near the armchair. Milo leaned back against the wall and waited. Ilara slowly stepped out from her hiding place. She kept her eyes fixed on Milo as she crouched down. Her tiny fingers picked up the carved horse, She held it tightly against her chest. "Thank you," Ilara whispered. Milo offered a solemn nod in response. He did not offer false smiles or overly enthusiastic words. He treated the child with a quiet dignity she had likely never experienced. Lucia felt a sudden tightening in her throat. She turned back to the hearth to stir the simmering pot. "Will you stay for supper?" Lucia asked, looking at the fire. Milo watched the flames reflect in her dark eyes. He thought of the cold stone walls waiting for him at the fortress. "If you have enough," Milo answered. Lucia reached for a third wooden bowl. "We always have enough," she said. Spring faded into the warmer days of early summer. Milo visited the isolated cottage twice a week without fail. He left his heavy armor and his sovereign titles at the edge of the trees. The brutal ruler of the north transformed into a quiet laborer upon entering the clearing. He swung a heavy iron axe behind the woodshed for hours. He split enough hookbogs to last them through the next 2 winters. Lucia did not ask him to perform these exhausting tasks. She simply left a pitcher of cold well water on the porch for him. He repaired the sagging wooden roof with fresh pine shingles. He fixed the broken hinges on the heavy oak door. The cottage slowly became a fortress of a different kind. Ilara lost her fear of the large man who occupied their space. She began to sit near his boots while he worked on his wood carvings. He never spoke to the child with childish tones or empty coddling. He answered her quiet questions with serious, deliberate honesty. Lucia watched them from the kitchen, mending a tear in his dark linen shirt. She felt a dangerous sense of comfort taking root in her chest. She had spent her entire life surviving alone against a harsh world. Now, she found herself listening for the sound of his horse on the dirt path. Their shared meals were quiet, but filled with a profound understanding. They operated like a family forged from discarded pieces. However, the forest could not keep the malevolent world at bay forever. A remnant faction of the crushed rebellion still hid in the eastern mountains. They lacked the numbers and the strength to assault Milo's stone stronghold. They survived on bitter vengeance and desperate schemes. Their scouts tracked the king's solitary movements through the valley. They noticed his predictable rides into the western woods. They deduced that the ruthless king possessed a hidden vulnerability. Heavy rain began to fall on a late Tuesday afternoon. The sky turned a dark, bruised purple as thunder rolled across the hills. Milo was delayed at his castle by an unexpected border dispute. He stood over a map table, his mind completely focused on the coming night. At the cottage, Lucia noticed the unnatural silence of the forest first. The birds had stopped singing long before the rain began. She stood by the window, watching the tree line closely. Dark figures moved stealthily between the thick trunks of the ancient pines. These were not the polished, disciplined guards of the king. They carried rusty weapons and moved with the erratic energy of desperate men. Lucia turned away from the glass instantly. Her maternal instincts overrode any sense of panic. She grabbed Ilara by the hand and pulled her toward the center of the room. She dragged the heavy woven rug away from the hearthstones. She lifted the iron ring hidden flush against the wooden floorboards. A dark, narrow root cellar opened beneath their feet. Smells of cold earth and stored potatoes drifted upward. "Get inside," Lucia ordered, her voice leaving no room for hesitation. Ilara looked at the dark hole and then at Lucia's face. She recognized the mortal danger in the older woman's eyes. The child climbed down the wooden ladder without shedding a single tear. Lucia knelt beside the opening, holding the trapdoor. "Do not make a sound, no matter what you hear," Lucia instructed. "Will Milo come?" the little girl whispered from the shadows. "He will," Lucia promised, praying the words were true. She lowered the heavy wooden door into place. She kicked the woven rug back over the secret entrance. She smoothed the edges of the fabric with her foot. Heavy footsteps splashed through the mud on the front porch. Low voices muttered harsh curses in the pouring rain. Lucia walked to the kitchen counter with purposeful strides. She picked up her bone-handled carving knife. She slipped the blade into the deep pocket of her apron. She then reached for the sturdy straw broom resting against the wall. She stood in the exact center of the room, directly over the cellar door. A violent blow struck the front of the cottage. The wooden panels groaned under the sudden impact. A second strike shattered the metal lock Milo had carefully repaired. The oak door swung open, slamming violently against the inner wall. Wind and rain whipped into the clean, warm room. 4 men stepped over the threshold, their boots dripping with foul mud. They wore ragged cloaks and held rusted swords drawn and ready. Their faces were hard, scarred by war and driven by malice. They looked around the modest room, expecting to find the king. They only saw a lone woman holding a simple broom. The leader of the mercenaries stepped forward, leaving a trail of dirt on the floor. "Where is he?" the man demanded, pointing his blade at her chest. Lucia gripped the wooden handle of her broom with white knuckles. She looked at the mud ruining her freshly swept stones. "You have tracked filth into my home," Lucia stated coldly. The mercenary laughed, a harsh and grating sound. "We will track blood if you do not answer the question," he threatened. He took another step closer, his eyes scanning the corners of the room. Lucia did not step back. She knew she had to hold their attention away from the rug beneath her feet. She slipped her free hand into her apron pocket, finding the hilt of her knife. She was prepared to die to keep the cellar a secret. The leader of the mercenaries sneered at the simple broom in Lucia's hands. He swung his rusted sword in a lazy, mocking arc. Lucia raised the wooden handle to block the incoming strike. The iron blade bit deeply into the dry straw and wood. The impact sent a painful jolt up her arms. She refused to drop the shattered tool. She planted her boots firmly against the hidden edge of the trapdoor. The mercenary yanked his sword backward with a rough curse. The broom snapped completely in half. Lucia stumbled slightly, but quickly regained her balance. She dropped the broken pieces onto the stone floor. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the carving knife. The bone handle felt small and inadequate against 4 armed men. The 3 other mercenaries laughed at her desperate defense. They moved slowly into the room, tracking wet mud across the clean stones. Rain lashed fiercely against the open window shutters. Thunder rumbled low and heavy across the darkened valley. "You are wasting our time, woman," the leader spat. He stepped forward, raising his weapon for a lethal strike. A sudden flash of lightning illuminated the open doorway. The thunder that followed was deafening, shaking the wooden beams. A massive silhouette stood completely still on the threshold. Milo blocked the storm entirely with his broad shoulders. Rainwater poured in heavy streams down his dark traveling cloak. He held no sword in his hands. His mere presence sucked the remaining air out of the small room. The mercenaries turned their heads toward the sudden intrusion. Their mocking laughter died instantly in their throats. They recognized the man they had spent months hunting. They also recognized the fatal mistake they had just made. Milo looked at the broken broom on the floor. He looked at the mud covering the hearthstones. Then his gaze locked onto the rusted sword pointed at Lucia. His eyes grew entirely black in the dim light of the cottage. He did not speak a single word of warning. Milo moved forward with a speed that defied his massive size. He crossed the room in 2 devastatingly fast strides. The first mercenary raised his blade in a panic. Milo caught the man the wrist in midair. He twisted his grip with absolute, unforgiving force. The mercenary dropped to his knees with a silent gasp of agony. Milo shoved the falling man backward into the wooden table. The heavy oak furniture splintered under the crushing impact. The second man thrust a dagger toward Milo's side. Milo stepped inside the guard, ignoring the weapon completely. He drove his fist directly into the center of the man's chest. The impact sounded like a heavy stone dropping onto frozen earth. The mercenary flew backward, crashing through the open door and into the mud outside. He did not move again. The third attacker lunged with a desperate, wild yell. Milo did not even look at him. He simply reached out and grabbed the man by the collar of his tunic. He hurled the attacker against the solid stone wall of the chimney. The man slumped to the floor, completely unconscious before he landed. Only the leader remained standing in the center of the room. His hands shook violently as he held his sword in front of him. He backed away, his boots slipping on the wet floor. Milo turned his full attention to the trembling man. The king did not draw a weapon. He walked forward slowly, letting the silence crush his enemy. The leader swung his sword in a blind, terrified arc. Milo ducked under the clumsy strike with smooth precision. He gripped the front of the mercenary's leather armor with both hands. He lifted the full-grown man entirely off his feet. Milo carried him toward the open doorway. He threw the leader out into the raging storm with immense power. The man landed heavily in the deep mud, instantly defeated. Milo stood in the doorway, staring out into the rain. His chest heaved with slow, controlled breaths. The violent storm outside seemed quiet compared to the fury in his veins. He waited a long moment to ensure no others hid in the trees. The forest offered no further resistance. Milo turned his back to the rain and looked at the ruined room. Shattered wood and dirty water covered the floorboards. The peaceful sanctuary he had helped build was heavily damaged. He looked across the room and found Lucia. She still stood over the woven rug, gripping her small knife. Her hands were shaking, but her chin remained held high. Milo felt the cold rage drain from his body. It was replaced by a sharp, suffocating fear. He walked toward her, stepping carefully around the debris. He stopped 2 paces away, respecting the weapon in her hand. "Are you hurt?" Milo asked, his voice low and strained. Lucia blinked, the reality of her survival finally setting in. She lowered the carving knife slowly. She slipped the blade back into her apron pocket. "I am uninjured," Lucia replied, her voice remarkably steady. She looked at the devastation surrounding them. "My floor is a disaster," she added quietly. Milo let out a breath he did not know he was holding. He felt the tension leave his shoulders. Lucia immediately dropped to her knees. She threw the heavy woven rug aside. She grabbed the iron ring and pulled the trapdoor open. Milo stepped closer, suddenly understanding her defensive stance. She had not been protecting herself. She had been protecting the ground beneath her feet. "Alara!" Lucia called out into the dark space. "It is safe now." A moment of silence stretched from the cellar. Then a small, pale face appeared at the bottom of the wooden ladder. Alara climbed the steps slowly, her eyes wide with lingering fear. Lucia reached down and pulled the child up into the room. She hugged the little girl tightly against her chest. Alara buried her face in Lucia's shoulder, remaining completely silent. Milo stood above them, watching the embrace. He remembered the rusted sword pointed at Lucia's chest. He realized how close he had come to losing everything that mattered. He knelt slowly beside them, resting his knees on the wet stones. He ignored the mud soaking into his dark trousers. He reached out a large, calloused hand. He gently placed it on Alara's trembling back. The child did not flinch from his touch. She turned her head slightly and looked at Milo. She saw the rainwater dripping from his dark hair. She saw the worry etched deeply into his harsh features. Alara released her grip on Lucia. She leaned forward and wrapped her small arms around Milo's thick neck. Milo froze completely. He had never been held by a child. His hands were meant for war and heavy labor. He did not know how to hold something so entirely fragile. He looked at Lucia, an uncharacteristic uncertainty in his eyes. Lucia offered him a small, reassuring nod. Milo slowly wrapped his large arms around the little girl. He pulled her gently against his broad chest. He rested his chin lightly on top of her head. The ruthless king closed his eyes, overwhelmed by a profound sense of peace. The storm continued to rage outside the broken door. Inside, sitting on the muddy floorboards, Milo finally understood his true purpose. He would rebuild the shattered door. He would scrub the blood and dirt from the stones himself. He would scorch the earth of any enemy who dared to approach this forest. He opened his eyes and looked directly at Lucia. The unspoken promise hung heavily in the air between them. He belonged to this cottage now. They sat together on the floor while the thunder slowly faded away. Milo remained awake long after the storm passed. He sat in the heavy armchair facing the broken doorway. His sword lay across his knees, completely clean and ready. Lucia and Alara slept together in the single bed near the hearth. The fire crackled quietly, fighting against the damp chill of the room. Milo watched the steady rise and fall of their breathing. He had spent years defending borders and crushing rebellions. He had never felt such a profound fear of failure until tonight. The wooden door was shattered beyond simple repair. The sanctuary was broken. Dawn arrived with pale, cold light filtering through the trees. Milo stood up and set his sword on the table. He walked to the entrance and began gathering the splintered wood. He carried the heavy debris outside, stacking it near the shed. He returned with a bucket of clean water from the well. He found a rag and knelt on the ruined floorboards. The ruler of the north scrubbed the mud and blood from the stones. He worked with the same intense focus he applied to battle strategy. Lucia woke to the sound of his quiet labor. She sat up slowly, careful not to wake the sleeping child beside her. She watched his broad back shift as he cleaned the floor. He had washed away the violence before they had to see it again. Lucia wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped out of bed. She walked over and placed a hand lightly on his shoulder. Milo stopped scrubbing and looked up at her. "You do not have to do this," Lucia said quietly. "The floor must be clean," Milo replied simply. He stood up, wiping his wet hands on a piece of cleaned cloth. He looked around the room, his expression entirely serious. "This place is no longer safe for you," he stated. Lucia followed his gaze to the ruined entrance. She knew he was telling the truth. The mercenaries had found them once, and others would try again. "I have lived here for 5 years," she murmured. It was the only place she had ever truly owned. "And you have defended it well," Milo acknowledged. He stepped closer, his presence warm against the morning chill. "But my enemies know you exist now." He looked at the bed where Alara was still sleeping peacefully. "I cannot leave lay guards here without drawing more attention." Lucia understood the grim reality of their situation. Her small knife and broken broom would not stop a second attack. "What do you suggest?" she asked, looking up into his dark eyes. "You will pack your belongings," Milo commanded gently. "I am taking you to the fortress." Lucia hesitated, her independent nature fighting against the idea. She knew the stories of his stone castle and the ruthless men who occupied it. It was a place of war and severe authority. "We are simple people, Milo," she argued softly. "We do not belong in a castle." Milo reached out and gently touched her cheek with his calloused thumb. You belong wherever I am, he corrected her. The absolute certainty in his voice left no room for doubt. He dropped his hand and turned toward the window. I will send a rider to bring a carriage, he decided. We do not need a carriage, Lucia stated firmly. I am perfectly capable of walking. Milo looked at her stubborn expression and allowed a faint smile. Then we will ride, he compromised. Lucia spent the next hour packing their meager possessions. She folded the small dresses she had made for Ilara. She wrapped her dried herbs in heavy linen cloth. She placed the wooden horse Milo had carved on top of the pile. Ilara woke up and watched the preparations in silence. The child did not ask questions. She simply held onto Lucia's skirt, sensing the impending change. Milo returned from the forest, leading his massive black warhorse. The animal snorted, its breath pluming in the crisp air. Milo secured Lucia's bags to the leather saddle. He lifted Ilara first, placing her securely behind the saddle pommel. He then turned to Lucia, offering his hand. She looked at the small cottage one last time. It looked vulnerable without its sturdy oak door. She placed her hand in his and let him lift her onto the tall horse. She sat behind the saddle, wrapping her arms around his waist. Milo mounted the horse effortlessly, sitting behind Ilara. He held the reins, creating a protective cage around the small child. The journey out of the forest was slow and deliberate. Milo kept a constant watch on the surrounding tree line. His hand never strayed far from the hilt of his sword. They reached the main road as the sun reached its highest point. A patrol of armored riders met them at the crossroads. The soldiers immediately drew their swords at the sight of strangers. The captain recognized his king and signaled his men to lower their weapons. They stared in absolute shock at the sight before them. Their merciless sovereign was sharing his personal mount with a peasant woman. He held a ragged orphan securely against his chest. Milo did not offer any explanations to his men. "Form a perimeter," he ordered coldly. The soldiers instantly obeyed, falling into a tight formation around the horse. They rode toward the massive stone fortress dominating the northern horizon. The heavy iron gates of the castle opened slowly as they approached. The courtyard was filled with knights, merchants, and busy servants. The noise of striking metal and shouting voices echoed off the high walls. A sudden hush fell over the crowd as the king's escort entered. Hundreds of eyes locked onto the black warhorse. They had seen their ruler return with bloody armor and captured enemies. They had never seen him return with a family. Milo ignored the staring crowd completely. He brought the horse to a halt near the main keep stairs. He dismounted smoothly, his boots hitting the stone pavement. He reached up and lifted Ilara down from the saddle. He did not hand the child to a waiting servant. He settled her against his hip, holding her securely with one strong arm. He then offered his other hand to Lucia. She slid down from the horse, her boots touching the stone courtyard. She felt entirely exposed beneath the gaze of the heavily armed guards. Milo stepped closer, his broad shoulder brushing against hers. He projected an aura of absolute dominance and possession. Anyone who looked at them understood the unspoken warning instantly. To threaten these two was to invite the wrath of the king. Milo walked up the stone steps toward the great hall. Lucia walked beside him, matching his steady pace. The heavy wooden doors were pulled open by two nervous sentries. The great hall was immense, filled with long tables and ancient banners. A massive fire roared in the central hearth, pushing back the damp cold. At the far end of the room sat a heavy iron throne. Milo's generals and advisors stood near the high table, pausing their discussions. They watched their sovereign approach with a child in his arms. Milo did not stop to acknowledge their formal bows. He walked directly toward the hearth, bypassing the Iron Throne entirely. He stopped in front of the blazing fire. He finally set Alara down on the warm stone floor. The child immediately grabbed his pant leg, intimidated by the vast space. Milo placed a reassuring hand on her small shoulder. He turned to his head steward, an older man with a shocked expression. "Prepare the chambers next to mine," Milo commanded. The steward blinked, struggling to process the order. "For the guests, my lord?" the steward asked carefully. Milo's eyes narrowed dangerously. "They are not guests," Milo stated, his voice echoing in the silent hall. "They belong here." He looked at the row of seasoned generals standing frozen nearby. "Any disrespect shown to them is disrespect shown to me." The absolute finality in his words left no room for misinterpretation. He had just elevated a peasant and an orphan above the highest lords. Milo turned his attention back to Lucia. She looked incredibly small in the massive stone hall. Yet she met his gaze with the same quiet strength she always possessed. She was not afraid of the castle, nor the dangerous men inside it. She only cared that they were safe together. Milo took a step toward her. "The floors here are stone," he said quietly, a faint smile touching his lips. "They are much harder to keep clean." Lucia finally relaxed, a genuine smile breaking across her face. "Then you will have to remember to take off your boots," she replied. The surrounding lords stared in horror at her audacious demand. They expected the king to strike her down for such insolence. Instead, Milo simply nodded. "I will remember," he promised. He led them toward the private stairs, leaving his shocked court behind. The Iron Throne remained empty for the rest of the day. The king had finally found a better place to sit. The spiral staircase was lit by flickering torches mounted on the walls. Lucia kept a firm grip on Alara's hand as they climbed higher into the keep. Milo walked slightly behind them, his heavy footsteps acting as a shield. They reached the highest level of the fortress, reserved strictly for the sovereign. Thick tapestries lined the corridor, dampening the harsh sounds of the castle below. Milo pushed open a heavy wooden door adorned with iron scrollwork. The chamber inside was larger than Lucia's entire cottage. A massive bed covered in heavy furs dominated the center of the room. A large window offered a sweeping view of the northern mountains and the dense forest below. The room was warm, heated by a large stone fireplace crackling with fresh pine logs. "This will be our space," Milo announced, stepping aside to let them enter. Lucia walked slowly across the thick woven carpets. She ran her fingers over the smooth, polished wood of the heavy wardrobe. It was a world of unimaginable luxury and stark contrast to her previous life. Alara immediately walked toward the fire, sitting on the plush rug. She pulled the wooden horse from Lucia's bag and began to plant quietly. Milo watched them settle in, a deep sense of satisfaction anchoring his chest. He had spent his life conquering territories he did not care about. Now, he had finally secured the only thing he actually valued. "I will have hot water brought up for a bath," he said, turning toward the door. Lucia turned around, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "Thank you, Milo," she said softly, meaning much more than the simple words conveyed. He nodded once, his hard expression softening completely. He closed the heavy door quietly behind him. He stood alone in the hallway, letting out a long, slow breath. The ruthless king had become a guardian, and he would slaughter anyone who tried to take them away. Sunlight pierced the heavy velvet curtains of the royal chamber. Lucia woke to the scent of burning pine and warm linen. She turned her head against the soft feather pillow. Milo was already awake, standing near the hearth in his dark trousers. He fastened a leather bracer around his forearm with methodical precision. His broad back carried the faded scars of countless brutal battles. Lucia sat up slowly, careful not to disturb the sleeping child beside her. "You are leaving early," Lucia noted, her voice quiet from sleep. Milo paused his movements and turned to face her. "The remaining mercenaries must be hunted down before they regroup," he explained. He walked toward the edge of the large wooden bed. He reached out and tucked a stray lock of dark hair behind her ear. His touch was surprisingly gentle for a man accustomed to wielding heavy steel. "I will return before the sun sets," Milo promised. "Do not leave this chamber without my personal guard." Lucia nodded, understanding the fragile nature of their new reality. She watched him buckle his heavy sword belt and leave the room with silent steps. The heavy oak door closed, leaving the vast chamber in perfect quiet. 2 hours passed in peaceful solitude. Servants arrived with silver trays laden with roasted meats and fresh fruit. They kept their eyes lowered, terrified of the woman who held the king's favor. Lucia thanked them politely, a simple gesture that only confused them further. She fed Alara small pieces of sweet apple and warm bread. The little girl sat on the thick woven rug, playing with her carved wooden horse. Heavy footsteps suddenly echoed in the stone corridor outside. Sharp voices argued with the guards stationed at the door. The heavy iron latch lifted without a polite knock. The door swung open to reveal a tall woman draped in emerald silk. Lady Vane stepped into the room with an air of absolute entitlement. She belonged to one of the oldest noble families in the Northern Dominion. 2 armed knights followed closely behind her, their hands resting on their weapons. Lucia stood up immediately, placing herself firmly between the intruders and Alara. She did not reach for a weapon, relying entirely on her cold composure. Lady Vane surveyed the large room with visible disdain. Her eyes lingered heavily on the simple woolen dress Lucia wore. "So, the rumors of the king's new charity are true," Lady Vane remarked coldly. She stepped further into the chamber, her expensive skirts sweeping across the stone floor. "I came to see the mud-stained peasant who has bewitched our sovereign." Lucia did not flinch at the deliberate insult. She had faced starving wolves and freezing winters in the wild. An arrogant woman in expensive fabric held no real terror for her. "You have entered without an invitation," Lucia stated evenly. "I suggest you leave before the guards remove you." Lady Vane let out a sharp, mocking laugh that grated against the quiet walls. "These halls belong to the nobility, not to nameless vagabonds," she declared. She walked toward the hearth, her malicious gaze fixing on the little girl. Alara clutched her wooden horse tightly, shrinking back from the stranger. "Is this the rat you dragged in from the gutter?" Lady Vane sneered. She reached out, intending to snatch the wooden toy from the child's hands. Lucia moved with a speed born of pure survival instinct. She stepped directly into Lady Vane's path. She slapped the noblewoman's outstretched hand away with a resounding smack. The sharp sound echoed loudly against the stone walls of the chamber. Lady Vane gasped in absolute shock, cradling her stinging wrist against her chest. Her 2 knights drew their heavy swords instinctively. Lucia stood her ground, her dark eyes flashing with dangerous defiance. "Touch her again, and you will lose that hand," Lucia warned. The brutal threat was delivered without shouting, making it utterly believable. Lady Vane's face turned a violent shade of crimson. "How dare you strike a lady of the court?" she screamed, abandoning her composed facade entirely. "Arrest this wretched woman immediately," she ordered her knights. The armed men hesitated, caught between their mistress and the absolute authority of the king's domain. they took a single, uncertain step forward. A massive shadow fell across the open doorway, extinguishing the light from the corridor. The temperature in the large room seemed to drop drastically. Milo stood on the threshold, his armor covered in fresh dust from the outer courtyard. He had returned hours earlier than his council anticipated. His dark eyes took in the drawn swords and the terrified posture of the child. His gaze finally locked onto the red mark blooming on Lady Vane's wrist. He did not need to ask what had happened in his absence. The murderous intent rolling off him was a physical, suffocating weight in the air. The two knights immediately dropped their steel swords to the floor. They fell to their knees, bowing their heads in complete, terrified submission. Lady Vane spun around, her arrogance evaporating into sudden panic. "My lord, this savage woman assaulted me unprovoked," she lied frantically. Milo ignored her desperate words completely. He walked slowly into the center of the silent room. The tension stretching between his heavy footsteps was agonizing. He stopped directly between Lucia and the trembling noblewoman. He did not even look at Lady Vane. He kept his eyes focused entirely on Lucia's calm face. "Did they frighten you?" Milo asked, his deep voice deceptively soft. "They merely proved their ignorance," Lucia replied, her breathing perfectly steady. Milo finally turned his head to look at the woman in emerald silk. The absolute void in his expression was more terrifying than any loud display of rage. "Your family has served this fortress for 3 generations, Milo stated coldly. "That history ends today." Lady Vane fell to her knees, her silk dress pooling uselessly on the stone. "Please, my sovereign, I only meant to enforce proper court protocol," she begged through falling tears. Milo looked down at her with absolute, unyielding disgust. "You dared to bring drawn steel into the sanctuary of my family," he declared. The word family struck the silent room with the undeniable force of a warhammer. It was a public, permanent declaration of their true status. "Your lands are completely forfeit to the crown," Milo commanded. "Your titles are stripped, and your name will be erased from the ledgers." He gestured toward the open doorway with a single sharp motion. "You have until nightfall to leave my territory, or you will swing from the outer walls." Lady Vane collapsed into hysterical sobs, realizing her vanity had destroyed her entire lineage. The two knights scrabbled to their feet in sheer terror. They dragged their disgraced mistress out of the chamber by her arms. They disappeared down the long corridor without daring to look back. Milo signaled to his personal guards standing outside the room. "Seal the corridor and post 10 men at this door," he ordered into the hallway. "Nobody enters without my explicit permission." The heavy oak door slammed shut, locking the treacherous chaos outside. Milo stood in the quiet room, his massive chest rising and falling slowly. He unbuckled his heavy sword, setting it on a nearby table with a loud clatter. He turned back to face the brave woman who had effortlessly stood up to his court. Lucia bent down and picked up the silver tray the servant had left earlier. She walked over to a small wooden table near the tall window. She set the tray down and poured a cup of warm, spiced wine. She handed the metal cup to the ruthless king without a single spoken word. Milo took the silver goblet, his rough fingers brushing gently against hers. He drank deeply, letting the warm liquid soothe his raw nerves. He sat down heavily on a wooden chair, running a hand through his dark hair. Ilara crept forward from the hearth, clutching her wooden horse tightly. She stood next to Milo's armored leg, looking up at his exhausted face. She patted his metal knee guard with a tiny, gentle hand. Milo looked down at the child, the violent shadows leaving his eyes completely. He reached into his leather pouch and pulled out a small, polished liverstone. He handed it to Ilara, who accepted the smooth gift with a bright, innocent smile. Lucia brought him a plate of cold roasted meat and cheese. "You returned early," she noted quietly. "The council found the remaining mercenaries attempting to cross the Eastern River," Milo explained. "They have been dealt with permanently." He picked up a piece of bread, suddenly realizing how intensely hungry he was. He ate the simple meal in the absolute presence of the only people who mattered. The vast fortress surrounding them was filled with hidden enemies and treacherous ambition. Yet inside this single chamber, there was only perfect, unbreakable peace. Lucia sat opposite him, watching him eat with a sense of profound contentment. She had lost her simple, isolated cottage in the deep woods. She had gained a dangerous protector who would gladly burn the world to keep her safe. Milo finished his food and set the empty plate aside. He leaned back in his chair, watching the warm firelight dance across Lucia's face. "The court will fear you now," Milo warned her softly. "They will whisper behind your back and plot in the dark shadows." Lucia met his intense gaze without a single ounce of hesitation. "I have lived in the shadows my entire life," she replied evenly. "I know how to navigate the dark without stumbling." Milo felt a sudden surge of fierce pride swell within his chest. He knew she did not need his protection to survive the harsh world. She merely allowed him the immense privilege of standing beside her. He stood up and crossed the small distance between them. He reached down and pulled her gently from her wooden chair. He wrapped his strong arms around her, pulling her against his armor. Lucia rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Alara walked over and leaned softly against Milo's leg. Milo dropped one large hand to rest comfortably on the child's soft hair. The three of them stood together in the fading afternoon light. Outside the heavy door, the Northern Dominion trembled at the terrible wrath of their sovereign. Inside, the brutal king was simply a man holding his family. Autumn winds swept through the northern mountains with a bitter, relentless edge. The heavy stone walls of the fortress kept the biting chill safely at bay. Milo stood by the large chamber window, watching the dark tree line in the distance. He wore only his linen trousers, leaving his scarred back exposed to the warm room. Lucia sat on the edge of the large wooden bed, folding a heavy woolen blanket. Alara slept soundly on a thick fur rug near the roaring stone fireplace. The flickering firelight caught the edge of a deep, jagged scar across Milo's left shoulder. It was a violent mark born of severe treachery, not an honorable battle wound. Lucia recognized the sinister nature of the old, healed injury immediately. She stood up and walked silently across the smooth stone floor. She reached out and traced the raised flesh with a remarkably gentle fingertip. Milo flinched slightly, a rare physical reaction from the hardened northern ruler. He did not pull away from her comforting touch. "My uncle gave me this reminder during my first year on the throne," Milo stated quietly. His deep voice held a heavy, exhausted weight accumulated over years of bloodshed. "He believed the crown belonged to a man with a much colder heart," he explained. Lucia pressed her warm palm flat against his tense, scarred skin. "He was entirely wrong," she said with absolute, unwavering certainty. "A cold heart shatters under pressure, but yours simply endured," she added. Milo turned around to face her in the dim, peaceful light of the chamber. The relentless shadows in his dark eyes seemed to recede completely. He looked at this ordinary woman who had once threatened him with a broken broom. She had healed his physical wounds on her dirty kitchen floor without hesitation. Now, she was effortlessly mending the fractured pieces of his isolated soul. He rested his forehead against hers, breathing in the familiar scent of dried lavender. A week later, the entire fortress prepared for the annual winter solstice banquet. It was the most significant political gathering of the Northern Dominion. Lords and generals traveled through heavy snow to officially pledge their continued loyalty. The castle staff buzzed with frantic, nervous energy as they prepared the Great Hall. 3 older servants brought a heavy velvet dress into Lucia's private chambers. The fabric was a deep midnight blue, elaborately embroidered with pure silver threads. Lucia touched the expensive material with cautious, hesitant hands. She had spent her entire life surviving in rough wool and patched linen garments. Ilara wore a smaller version of the same elegant, heavy dress. The child looked like a true noble, though her dark eyes remained watchful and sharp. Ilara stood rigidly, terrified of ruining the pristine fabric with a careless movement. Lucia knelt and adjusted the silver collar around the little girl's neck. "You wear the dress." "Ilara, do not let the dress wear you," Lucia instructed gently. Milo entered the room wearing his formal dark armor and a heavy winter cloak. He wore a harsh silver crown adorned with uncut dark sapphires. He stopped in the center of the room, staring at Lucia in complete, stunned silence. The simple housemaid had transformed into a striking, undeniable sovereign. "You look entirely uncomfortable," Milo noted, a faint smile touching his hard lips. "I feel trapped in a beautiful silken cage," Lucia admitted honestly. She tugged nervously at the tight silver lacing on her long sleeves. "I prefer my cotton apron and my bone-handled carving knife," she told him. Milo walked over and took her small hands in his rough, calloused grip. "You will never need to wield a knife in defense again," he promised her. "I will be the ruthless blade in the dark for you." He lifted her chin, forcing her to meet his intense, protective gaze. "Tonight, they will see exactly who commands my absolute loyalty," he stated. The great hall was packed with hundreds of nervous, whispering nobles. Massive iron chandeliers cast a warm, flickering light over the long banquet tables. The low murmur of political gossip ceased the moment the heavy doors groaned open. Milo walked into the hall with a slow, deeply commanding stride. He did not walk alone, completely ignoring the ancient traditions of his ancestors. He held Lucia's hand securely in his powerful right grip. His left hand rested protectively on Ilara's small, fragile shoulder. The nobility bowed deeply, keeping their eyes fixed firmly on the stone floor. Milo guided his unexpected family toward the raised dais at the far end. The harsh iron throne sat empty, flanked by heavy black wolf banners. A second, smaller throne of carved oak had been placed directly beside it. The nobles exchanged nervous glances, recognizing the profound shift in absolute power. Milo stepped up to the dais and turned to face his kneeling subjects. He did not sit down on his imposing iron seat. He gestured to the master of ceremonies with a single, sharp nod. The older man stepped forward, carrying a black velvet cushion with trembling hands. A delicate circlet of pure silver and forged oak leaves rested on the velvet. Milo lifted the heavy crown with careful, deliberate hands. He turned to face Lucia, his expression solemn and completely absolute. "I have ruled this territory through fear and severe retribution," Milo spoke loudly. His deep voice carried easily to the very back of the silent, terrified hall. "I conquered enemies, but I never truly defended a home until I met you." Lucia looked up at him, her heart beating a steady rhythm against her ribs. She saw the ruthless warlord and the gentle woodcarver existing in perfect harmony. "You offered sanctuary to a bleeding stranger when you had nothing," Milo continued. "You offered kindness to an abandoned orphan without seeking any political reward." He took a step closer, raising the silver crown slowly above her dark hair. "You possess the true strength that this broken kingdom desperately needs." He lowered the circlet, placing it gently onto her head. "I name you my equal, my sanctuary, and my sovereign wife," Milo declared. The absolute finality of his words sealed her elevated fate forever. He turned his head toward the silent crowd of wealthy aristocrats. "Bow to your queen," Milo commanded. The order cracked through the hall like a deadly, unforgiving whip. The entire northern court pressed their foreheads closer to the cold stone floor. They offered their absolute submission to a woman who once swept dirt for a living. Lucia looked out over the sea of kneeling lords and powerful ladies. She felt a profound sense of vindication replace her initial discomfort. The cruel world that had constantly punished the weak was finally bending the knee. Milo wrapped his heavy arm around her waist, pulling her securely against his armor. Ilara stood beside them, holding tightly onto Lucia's silk skirts. The orphan child watched the powerful nobles grovel on the ground before them. She realized with sudden clarity that she would never go hungry or cold again. Milo finally sat down on his harsh, uncomfortable iron throne. He pulled Lucia down to sit beside him on the polished oak chair. The extravagant banquet commenced with a strange, highly respectful quiet. The lords offered their formal pledges of fealty one by one in slow succession. They brought expensive gifts of heavy gold, rare animal furs, and forged steel. Lucia accepted the offerings with polite, unyielding, cold grace. She did not forget the casual cruelty these people were capable of inflicting. She would use this new absolute power to protect the fragile edges of their world. Milo watched her navigate the treacherous court with incredible natural instinct. He drank his spiced wine, feeling a deep, unfamiliar peace settle in his bones. He had spent his entire life surrounded by hired assassins and desperate sycophants. Now, he was surrounded by true loyalty forged in the fire of shared survival. The grand banquet lasted until the early, freezing hours of the morning. The massive fire in the central hearth burned down to a pile of glowing embers. Milo stood up, officially signaling the end of the exhausting public spectacle. He lifted Ilara into his arms as the child had fallen asleep against the throne. He offered his other hand to Lucia, helping her stand gracefully. They walked out of the great hall, leaving the exhausted nobles far behind. The heavy oak doors closed, sealing the dangerous political world away. They climbed the spiral staircase toward the safety of their private chambers. The castle was quiet, guarded exclusively by fiercely loyal men in the shadows. Milo laid Ilara onto the thick rug near the warm fireplace in their room. He covered the sleeping child carefully with a heavy woolen blanket. He then turned to Lucia, who was already untying the silver laces of her dress. He walked over and brushed her hands away with gentle, possessive authority. He unfastened the tight cords himself, freeing her from the restrictive heavy fabric. The velvet dress fell to the floor, leaving her in a simple linen shift. Lucia let out a long sigh of immense, genuine relief. She walked over to a nearby wooden table and picked up her bone-handled carving knife. She placed the familiar, worn weapon on the nightstand near the large bed. Milo watched the action, a deep rumble of amusement vibrating in his broad chest. "Do you still plan to stab my royal guards, my queen?" he asked lightly. Lucia turned and gave him a serious, completely unwavering look. "Only if they track mud onto my clean stone floors," she replied. Milo let out a genuine rumbling laugh that filled the quiet, secure chamber. He crossed the room and pulled her firmly against his chest. He rested his chin on the top of her head, breathing in the scent of lavender again. The most dangerous man in the world had found his absolute weakness. He had also found his ultimate, undeniable strength in her arms. Deep winter solidified the grip over the northern fortress. Ice coated the high stone parapets and froze the courtyard fountains. Milo fastened the heavy leather clasps of his riding cloak. He needed to inspect the remote northern watchtowers before the mountain passes became impassable. He did not want to leave the safety of his inner sanctum. He kissed Lucia on the forehead and rested a heavy hand on Ilara's shoulder. He promised to return before the sun disappeared behind the western peaks. His personal guard remained stationed outside the royal chambers. The castle fell into a quiet routine of domestic chores and murmured diplomacy. Treachery rarely announces itself with loud trumpets or marching drums. It creeps through the service corridors wearing borrowed clothes. A disgraced knight loyal to the banished Lady Vane had remained behind. He traded his polished armor for the rough wool of a firewood carrier. His goal was not the heavily guarded sovereign himself. He sought leverage by targeting the vulnerable child who had softened the ruthless ruler. Lucia sat near the hearth, mending a tear in one of Milo's spare tunics. Alara arranged her growing collection of wooden animals on the warm rug. The heavy oak door opened softly, bypassing the guards stationed outside. The trader had used an old servant's passage built directly into the chimney stonework. Lucia did not hear the intruder enter the vast chamber. She felt the sudden shift in the air currents near the fire. She dropped the needle and thread instantly. Her hand slipped into the deep pocket of her morning dress. Her fingers wrapped around the familiar bone handle of her carving knife. She turned her head slowly, keeping her expression devoid of panic. The disguised knight stood near the wardrobe, holding a short blade. His eyes were fixed hungrily on the oblivious orphan playing on the floor. Lucia did not scream for the guards. Shouting would trigger a desperate lunge from the cornered assassin. She stood up smoothly and moved between the knight and the child. "Alara, take your horse and go into the dressing alcove," Lucia instructed. Her voice carried the calm, sharp authority of a veteran survivor. The little girl recognized the serious tone immediately. Alara scooped up her wooden toys and ran into the narrow, windowless side room. The knight realized his element of surprise was ruined. He stepped forward, raising his weapon toward Lucia. "Move aside, peasant," the man spat, dropping his subservient disguise. "You have cost my lady her ancestral home." Lucia gripped her knife firmly, pointing the short blade upward. She backed away slowly, drawing him further into the center of the room. "Your lady cost herself her home through arrogance," Lucia corrected him. She kept her eyes locked on his shifting footwork. The man lunged forward with a reckless, angry thrust. Lucia dodged sideways, allowing his blade to catch only the fabric of her skirt. She slashed her knife across the back of his hand. The knight hissed in pain and dropped his weapon to the floor. He reached out with his uninjured hand to grab her throat. A massive impact shook the heavy wooden door of the chamber. The iron hinges screamed as the door was kicked open from the outside. Milo stood in the corridor, breathing heavy clouds of frost into the warm air. He had turned his horse around 10 miles out, driven by an unexplainable instinct. He saw the bleeding knight lunging toward his wife. The king crossed the massive room faster than a striking viper. He did not draw his heavy broadsword. Milo grabbed the back of the knight's woolen collar and hauled him backward. He threw the man against the solid stone wall with bone-crushing force. The assassin slumped to the floor, instantly incapacitated. Milo placed his heavy leather boot on the man's chest, pinning him down. He looked at Lucia, scanning her body for any signs of injury. She stood perfectly still, lowering her small knife. "I am unharmed," Lucia assured him immediately. Milo exhaled a long, ragged breath, the tension leaving his broad shoulders. He looked down at the broken man pinned beneath his heel. The royal guards rushed into the room, their weapons drawn. "Remove this filth from my sight," Milo ordered the captain of the guard. "Find the passage he used and seal it with solid iron." The guards dragged the unconscious traitor away and secured the chamber. Milo walked over to the dressing alcove and knelt on the floor. Alara peeked out from behind a hanging tapestry. Milo extended his large hand, offering a silent promise of safety. The child ran forward and threw her arms around his thick neck. He stood up, carrying the little girl over to where Lucia stood. He wrapped his free arm around his wife, pulling them both close. The stone fortress was impenetrable from the outside. Yet the internal politics would always harbor shadows and hidden daggers. "Pack a bag," Milo said quietly, looking over Lucia's head. Lucia leaned back and looked up at his tired face. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Home," Milo answered simply. 2 hours later, a small group of riders left the main gates. Milo wore no royal insignia or heavy plate armor. He dressed in the simple leather and wool of a northern huntsman. They rode through the snow-covered forest paths in complete silence. The tension of the court melted away with every mile they traveled. The isolated clearing finally appeared through the thick pine trees. The small cottage stood resilient against the harsh winter landscape. Milo had dispatched his best carpenters weeks ago to repair the damage. The shattered door was replaced with reinforced, solid oak. Smoke drifted lazily from the stone chimney, signaling a pre-lit fire. Milo dismounted his horse and helped Lucia down to the snowy ground. He carried Ilara on his shoulders, the child laughing at the sudden height. They walked up to the front porch together. Milo stopped at the threshold and looked down at his heavy boots. He deliberately unbuckled the leather straps and pulled them off. He set the muddy footwear neatly on the woven mat outside. Lucia smiled, unlocking the new door and stepping inside. The cottage smelled of fresh wood shavings and dried herbs. It was much smaller than their royal chambers, but it felt infinitely larger. There were no hidden passages or whispering nobles here. There was only the quiet truth of their shared existence. Milo walked into the kitchen area in his woolen socks. He picked up a sturdy straw broom resting near the hearth. He began to sweep the clean stones with methodical, practiced strokes. Lucia tied a simple cotton apron over her dress. She pulled a bag of flour and a black of salted butter from her supplies. She began to prepare the evening meal while Ilara arranged her wooden horses on the floor. The ruler of the north did not issue any commands. He chopped vegetables and fetched fresh water from the well. They worked together in a rhythm born of mutual respect and survival. Night fell over the quiet forest, cloaking the cottage in deep darkness. The small wooden table was set with 3 wooden doons. Milo sat on the sturdy bench, eating the hot stew with quiet appreciation. He looked at the woman who had saved him with a broom and a bandage. He looked at the child who had taught him how to carve toys. He had spent his youth chasing power and crushing rebellions. He realized now that all his violent conquests were merely preparation. The wars had hardened him so he could become an immovable shield for them. Lucia reached across the table and covered his calloused hand with her own. "Are you thinking about the castle?" she asked, softly. Milo turned his hand over, intertwining his thick fingers with hers. "I am thinking that I never want to leave this room," he replied. He meant every single word. The crown was heavy, and the iron throne was always cold. But sitting in this small wooden house, the Alpha King was finally at peace. He had found his true kingdom in the warmth of their hands. The story ends here. If this touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel. I'd really love to know where in the world you're listening from today. Leave your city in the comments below, and tell me how Milo and Lucia's journey made you feel. See you in the next story.